The cold wind swept across the dusty streets of Wallace, Arizona territory as Hope Nicholson stumbled into the saloon, her once beautiful face now gaunt with exhaustion and desperation. The year was 1883, and like many who had come to this frontier town seeking fortune, she had found only misery. 3 hungry children waited for her in a ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of town, and tonight, like every night for the past month, she would sell the only thing she had left to keep them alive. Xavier O'Malley noticed her the moment she entered, though he pretended not to. The tall cowboy kept his eyes fixed on his whiskey, but his attention was drawn to the woman with the haunted eyes, who spoke in hushed tones to Harry Diggs, the saloon owner. Xavier had ridden into Wallace just 2 days prior, trail-worn and looking for work after delivering a herd of cattle from Texas. What he hadn't expected to find was a woman whose quiet dignity pierced through her obvious desperation. "Same as usual, Hope?" Harry asked, his voice carrying across the mostly empty room. "Upstairs is free. I'll send anyone interested your way." Xavier watched as Hope nodded, her shoulders squared despite the shame that colored her cheeks. She climbed the stairs slowly, like each step was a mountain, and disappeared into one of the rooms above. Harry approached Xavier's table with a bottle. "Refill, cowboy." "Who is she?" Xavier asked, nodding toward the stairs. Harry poured the amber liquid into Xavier's glass. "Hope Nicholson, widow. 3 kids to feed and no kin to help. Started working here about a month ago after her husband got himself killed in a mining accident. Decent woman, just desperate." Harry shrugged as if to say such stories were common in Wallace. Xavier downed his drink in one swallow. "How much? For another whiskey? 2 cents? "No," Xavier said, his voice low. "For her. For the night." Harry named a price that made Xavier's jaw tighten. It wasn't much, barely enough to feed a family for a few days, but it was all a woman like Hope could command in a town filled with miners and cowboys who spent most of their money on liquor. Xavier placed several gold coins on the table, far more than Harry had asked for. "I want more than a night," he said. "I want all of her nights. Tell her she doesn't have to do this anymore." Harry's eyebrows shot up. "You buying her out completely?" "Something like that," Xavier replied, standing up. "Just make sure she knows she's free to choose what happens next." The saloon owner counted the money with wide eyes. "Sure thing, mister. But what do I tell the other fellas who've been regular customers?" Xavier's blue eyes hardened. "Tell them to find somewhere else to spend their time." Hope sat on the edge of the worn bed, her trembling hands smoothing her threadbare dress. Each night was harder than the last, the shame burning deeper, but the memory of her children's hungry faces steeled her resolve. Little Sarah was only 7, Thomas 5, and baby Rebecca just 3. Their hollowed cheeks haunted her dreams, and she would endure any degradation to fill their bellies. A knock on the door made her stomach clench. She drew a deep breath, arranged her features into a blank mask, and called, "Come in." Harry entered, looking oddly uncomfortable. In his hands was a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "There's been a change tonight, Hope," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "The cowboy downstairs, the tall one with the black hat, he's paid for your services, but not just for tonight." Hope's heart sank. Some men had tried this before buying her for several days at a time, thinking it would be cheaper. It always meant rougher treatment. "For how long?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "For good," Harry replied, tossing the pouch onto the bed beside her. "He says you're free to go. That's enough money to keep you and your little ones fed for months if you're careful." Hope stared at the pouch, unable to comprehend what Harry was saying. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," Harry admitted. "But he was mighty clear about it. Said to tell you that you're free to choose what happens next." He backed toward the door. "He's waiting downstairs if you want to thank him, or you can just take the money and leave. Your choice." When Harry was gone, Hope opened the pouch with shaking hands. Inside was more money than she had seen since before her husband Daniel's death. Tears blurred her vision as she counted it once, then again, hardly believing what she saw. This was freedom, freedom from the nightly humiliation, freedom from watching her children grow thinner despite her sacrifices. But why would a stranger do this? What did he want in return? Hope had learned that men rarely gave without expecting something back, especially something more valuable than what they offered. She tucked the money securely into her dress pocket and made her way downstairs. The saloon had grown busier in the hour she'd been upstairs, but she spotted him immediately, the tall cowboy sitting alone at a corner table, his black hat pulled low over his eyes. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, and Hope felt something strange pass between them, not desire or gratitude, but recognition, as though they had known each other in another life. With cautious steps, she approached his table. "Mr. Harry says you purchased my freedom." Xavier gestured to the chair across from him. "Join me?" Hope hesitated, then sat down, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "Why would you do such a thing for a stranger?" Xavier studied her for a moment before answering. "I've been riding for 10 years, madam. Seen a lot of people in bad situations. Most put themselves there through greed or foolishness, but sometimes—" He paused, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Sometimes good folks just get dealt a bad hand." "And you think I'm one of those good folks?" Hope asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You don't know anything about me?" "I know you have 3 children," Xavier replied calmly. "I know you're doing whatever it takes to keep them fed. That tells me enough." Hope's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "How do you know about my children?" "Harry mentioned them," Xavier explained, "and I've been in town long enough to hear talk." Hope's fingers closed around the pouch in her pocket. "What do you want from me, mister?" "O'Malley, Xavier O'Malley, and I don't want anything from you, Mrs. Nicholson." "Everyone wants something," Hope insisted. Xavier leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I just wanted to do something decent for once. Lord knows I've done enough that wasn't." Hope didn't know what to make of this strange man with his piercing blue eyes and quiet manner. He didn't leer at her like the others, didn't try to touch her or make suggestive comments. He simply sat there, regarding her with a respect she hadn't felt in months. "I have to get home to my children," she said finally, rising from the chair. "They'll be worried." Xavier nodded. "Of course." Hope turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley. I don't know why you did this, but thank you." "One more thing, Mrs. Nicholson," Xavier called as she reached the door. "I'm looking for work. I hear the Sullivan Ranch is hiring. If you know of any place I might stay while I'm in town, I'd be obliged." Hope hesitated, torn between gratitude and caution. "There's Mrs. Wilkins's boarding house on Cedar Street," she said finally. "She's fair with her rates." With that, Hope slipped out into the night, clutching the pouch of money like a talisman. For the first time in weeks, she hurried home not with dread, but with hope, a precious commodity she had almost forgotten existed. The cabin was dark when Hope returned, save for a single candle flickering in the window. Sarah, her eldest, had fallen asleep in a chair by the door, her thin body curled up like a kitten's. Hope's heart ached at the sight. Sarah had taken on too much responsibility for a child her age, watching over her siblings while her mother was away. "Mama's home," Hope whispered, gently stroking Sarah's hair. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mama, is it morning already?" "No, sweetheart, it's still night, but I'm home early." Hope scooped her daughter into her arms, savoring the weight of her. "How are Thomas and Rebecca?" "They're asleep. Thomas was crying because his stomach hurt, but I gave him some of the bread like you told me to." Hope carried Sarah to the small bedroom, where all 3 children slept in a single bed. Thomas and Rebecca were nestled together under the thin blanket, their breaths forming a gentle rhythm. Hope tucked Sarah in beside them. "Tomorrow will be better," she promised, kissing each child's forehead. "We're going to be all right now." In the main room of the cabin, Hope emptied the pouch onto the table and counted the money again by candlelight. There was enough to buy food, coal, maybe even new clothes for the children. But what then? The money would run out eventually. She needed something more sustainable, a real job perhaps, or a way to leave Wallace altogether and start fresh somewhere else. As she sat contemplating her options, Hope thought of Xavier O'Malley and his unexpected kindness. There had been something in his eyes, not pity, but understanding, as if he too knew what it was to be desperate. The next morning, Hope woke early and prepared a breakfast better than any the children had seen in months. She had slipped out at dawn to the general store, which opened early for ranchers and miners heading to work. The owner, Mr. Peterson, had stared in surprise when she placed actual money on the counter instead of asking for credit. "Mama, are we rich now?" Thomas asked, his mouth full of scrambled eggs. Hope smiled, running her hand through his dark hair. "No, not rich. But things are going to be better from now on, I promise." "Are you going to go away again tonight?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes serious. Hope's heart constricted. How much did Sarah understand about what her mother had been doing? "No, sweetheart. I don't have to go away anymore. I'm going to stay right here with you." After breakfast, Hope made a decision. She needed to thank Xavier O'Malley properly and perhaps understand better why he had done what he did. Leaving the children with Mrs. Cooper, a kind neighbor who had often watched them while Hope worked, she made her way to Mrs. Wilkins's boarding house. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with a small porch and flower boxes in the windows. Mrs. Wilkins, a widow in her 50s who ruled her establishment with an iron fist and a warm heart, answered Hope's knock. "Hope Nicholson," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What brings you here?" "I'm looking for a man who might have taken a room last night," Hope explained. "Xavier O'Malley. Tall, dark hair, wears a black hat." Mrs. Wilkins nodded. "He's here. Paid for a week in advance. Polite fellow, keeps to himself." Her expression softened slightly. "He's out back chopping wood for me. Said he wanted to earn his keep." Hope followed Mrs. Wilkins through the house and out to the backyard, where Xavier was indeed splitting logs with an axe. He had removed his hat and shirt in the morning heat, and Hope found herself momentarily transfixed by the play of muscles across his back as he worked. He was lean but strong, his skin tanned from years under the sun and scattered with scars that spoke of a hard life. Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat. "Mr. O'Malley, you have a visitor." Xavier turned, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. When he saw Hope, a look of surprise crossed his face, followed by something warmer. "Mrs. Nicholson." "I'll leave you two to talk," Mrs. Wilkins said, retreating into the house with a curious glance between them. Xavier reached for his shirt, pulling it on quickly. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I wanted to thank you properly," Hope said, finding it difficult to meet his eyes now that they were alone. "What you did. I don't know how I can repay such kindness." "You don't need to repay anything," Xavier insisted, buttoning his shirt. "It wasn't a loan." Hope twisted her hands together, a habit when she was nervous. "Then what was it? I still don't understand why you would do such a thing for a woman you don't even know." Xavier picked up his hat from where it hung on a fence post, turning it in his hands. "My mother was in a similar situation once," he said finally. "After my father died, she did what she had to do to keep me fed. No one helped her." He placed the hat on his head. "I couldn't help her then, but I could help you." The simple explanation hit Hope with unexpected force. She blinked back tears. "I'm sorry about your mother." Xavier shrugged, but the gesture couldn't hide the old pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago." "Are you really looking for work at the Sullivan Ranch?" Hope asked, changing the subject. "I am. Planning to head out there today. I hear they're looking for experienced hands." Hope nodded. "They are. My husband used to work for them before he took the mining job." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Sullivan is a fair employer. Pays on time and treats his men well." "Good to know." Xavier studied her face. "What about you, Mrs. Nicholson? What will you do now?" It was the question Hope had been asking herself all night. "I'm not sure yet. The money you gave me will last a while if I'm careful, but I need to find a way to support my children in the long term. I used to be a school teacher before I married Daniel and moved west. Perhaps I could do that again." Wallace could use a good teacher, Xavier agreed, though from what I've seen it's a rough town for a woman alone. The implication hung in the air between them. Hope straightened her shoulders. I've survived worse than rough towns, Mr. O'Malley. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't doubt that for a second, Mrs. Nicholson. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Xavier cleared his throat. If you'll excuse me, I should finish this wood for Mrs. Wilkins and then head out to the Sullivan place. Of course. Hope turned to leave, then paused. Mr. O'Malley, if you're successful at the ranch, my children and I live in the small cabin just past the creek on the east side of town. Perhaps you might stop by someday. I make a decent apple pie when I have the ingredients. Xavier's smile reached his eyes this time. I'd like that very much, Mrs. Nicholson. As Hope walked back through town, she felt lighter than she had in months. The money in her pocket was part of it. Yes, the security of knowing her children wouldn't go hungry. But there was something else, too. Something about Xavier O'Malley's quiet strength and unexpected kindness had awakened a feeling she thought had died with her husband. Hope. Xavier rode the 5 miles to the Sullivan Ranch with thoughts of Hope Nicholson turning in his mind. He hadn't planned on staying in Wallace long, just long enough to rest before moving on to California, where he'd heard the cattle business was booming. He'd spent the past decade drifting from one job to the next, never putting down roots, never looking back. But something about Hope's quiet dignity and the love she clearly had for her children had touched something in him he'd thought long buried. The Sullivan Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of decent grazing land. The main house was modest but well-maintained, with a large barn and several outbuildings nearby. A man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, was mending a fence as Xavier rode up. "Mr. Sullivan?" Xavier called, dismounting. The man straightened, eyeing Xavier warily. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "Name's Xavier O'Malley. I heard you might be hiring. I've got 10 years' experience as a ranch hand and cattle driver." Sullivan wiped his hands on a handkerchief. "Where'd you work last?" "Drove a herd up from the McAllister spread in Texas." Sullivan nodded slowly. "McAllister runs a good operation. Why'd you leave?" "It was just trail work. Contract ended with the delivery." Xavier met the rancher's evaluating gaze steadily. "I'm looking for something more permanent." "Permanent, eh?" Sullivan seemed to find this interesting. "Most cowboys passing through here aren't looking to settle." Xavier shrugged. "Maybe I'm tired of passing through." After a moment's consideration, Sullivan nodded. "I could use an experienced hand. Had 2 men quit last month to try their luck in the silver mines. Fools. Ranching may not make you rich overnight, but it's steady work." He extended his hand. $30 a month plus room and board in the bunkhouse. We'll try each other out for a month and see how it goes." Xavier shook the offered hand. "Fair enough." "You can start tomorrow," Sullivan said. "Today you can get settled in the bunkhouse and meet the other hands." As Xavier led his horse toward the barn, Sullivan called after him. "O'Malley, where'd you hear I was hiring?" "Hope Nicholson mentioned it," Xavier replied. Something like recognition flickered across Sullivan's face. "Daniel Nicholson's widow? You know her?" "We've met," Xavier said carefully. Sullivan studied him for a moment. "Daniel was a good worker. Shame about the accident. His wife's had it rough since then, from what I hear." Xavier remained silent, not wanting to betray Hope's confidence or dignity. Sullivan seemed to understand. "Well, any friend of the Nicholsons is welcome here. Daniel saved my son from a stampede once. I never forgot that." That night, as Xavier settled into his bunk in the ranch's bunkhouse, he found himself thinking again of Hope, of her clear eyes, and the gentle way she'd spoken of her children. It had been a long time since a woman had occupied his thoughts this way. Most of his encounters over the years had been brief and meaningless, just a way to satisfy a physical need. But Hope stirred something different in him, something he both welcomed and feared. "You're a fool, O'Malley," he muttered to himself as he drifted off to sleep. "A damn fool." Over the next 2 weeks, Xavier threw himself into work at the Sullivan Ranch. He mended fences, rounded up strays, broke a particularly stubborn horse that had been giving the other hands trouble, and generally proved his worth. Sullivan seemed pleased with his new hire, and the other ranch hands, initially wary of the quiet newcomer, gradually accepted him into their rough brotherhood. True to his word, Xavier rode into town on his first day off to visit Hope and her children. He brought with him small gifts, a bag of hard candy for the children, some fresh beef from the ranch, and a bolt of blue fabric he'd purchased from the general store that he thought might match Hope's eyes. The cabin looked different in daylight than it had the night he'd followed her home to make sure she arrived safely. It was small and worn, but someone had planted flowers by the door, and the windows were clean, if cracked in places, signs of pride despite poverty. Xavier had just dismounted when the door flew open, and a small girl with dark braids appeared. Her eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you the cowboy?" she demanded, planting her hands on her hips in a gesture that instantly reminded Xavier of Hope. "I reckon I am," Xavier replied, fighting a smile. "You must be Sarah." The girl nodded solemnly. "Mama said you might come. She's making apple pie." Her nose wrinkled slightly. "She made us clean the whole house this morning." "Sarah Nicholson," Hope's voice came from inside. "Don't keep Mr. O'Malley standing outside." Sarah grabbed Xavier's hand with surprising strength and tugged him toward the door. "Come meet Thomas and Rebecca. Thomas has been asking all morning if you're a real cowboy with guns and everything." The interior of the cabin was simple but meticulously clean. A small fire burned in the hearth despite the warm day, and the scent of baking apples filled the air. Two younger children watched from behind a worn sofa, a boy with a serious expression and a tiny girl with wild curls who sucked her thumb as she stared at the stranger. And then there was Hope, wiping her hands on an apron, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. She wore a simple dress, patched in places but clean, and her hair was pulled back from her face in a practical knot. To Xavier, she had never looked more beautiful. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, smiling uncertainly, "you came?" "I said I would," he replied, suddenly feeling awkward with his gifts. "I brought a few things, nothing much." He handed over his offerings, and Hope's expression as she examined each one made something tighten in Xavier's chest. It was as if no one had given her anything in a very long time. "The fabric is lovely," she said, running her fingers over the blue cloth, "much too fine for everyday wear." "Maybe for a Sunday dress, then," Xavier suggested. Sarah had already discovered the candy and was eyeing it hopefully. Hope smiled at her daughter's transparent longing. "You may each have one piece before dinner," she told the children, "and say thank you to Mr. O'Malley." 3 small voices chorused their thanks, though little Rebecca spoke so softly that Xavier had to lean down to hear her. Thomas, emboldened by the gift, stepped forward to inspect Xavier more closely. "Do you have a gun?" he asked, eyes bright with excitement. Xavier nodded toward the holster at his hip. "I do, but it's not a toy, son. It's a tool and sometimes a burden." Thomas looked disappointed by this philosophical response, but Sarah nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Like Mama's sewing needle," she said. "Useful but dangerous if you're not careful." Xavier glanced at Hope, impressed. "Your daughter's quite perceptive." Hope smiled proudly. "Sarah has always been wise beyond her years." Something passed over her face, a shadow of regret, perhaps, for the childhood her daughter had partly missed due to circumstances. The afternoon passed pleasantly. Hope served the apple pie, which was indeed delicious, along with coffee for the adults and milk for the children. Xavier found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around others. He told the children sanitized stories of his travels, cattle drives, and wild horses, beautiful sunsets over distant mountains, and the strange and wonderful people he had met on his journeys. "Have you ever been to California, Mr. O'Malley?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Not yet," Xavier admitted, "but I plan to go someday." "Daniel always talked of taking us to California," Hope said softly. "He said the ocean was the most magnificent sight a person could see." "Is that where you're headed next?" Sarah asked, a hint of disappointment in her voice. Xavier hesitated. "I don't know. I've taken a job at the Sullivan Ranch for now." For how long? This from Hope, who immediately looked as if she wished she hadn't asked. Mr. Sullivan and I agreed to try it for a month, Xavier said, but I'm thinking of staying longer if he'll have me. The smile that lit Hope's face was worth every sacrifice Xavier had ever made. Wallace could use more good men, she said simply. As the afternoon waned, Xavier helped Thomas repair a wooden toy horse while Hope and Sarah cleared away the dishes. Little Rebecca, who had been shy at first, now sat contentedly on Xavier's knee, occasionally touching his beard with wondering fingers. "You're good with children," Hope observed, returning from the small kitchen area. Xavier shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "Never spent much time around them, to be honest, but these three make it easy." He looked down at Rebecca, who had fallen asleep against his chest. "She's had a busy day, I reckon." Hope gently lifted her youngest from Xavier's lap. "It's past her nap time. If you'll excuse me for a moment, I'll put her down." While Hope was gone, Sarah approached Xavier with the serious expression he was coming to recognize as her thinking face. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, her voice pitched low so Thomas couldn't hear, "are you the man who gave Mama money so she doesn't have to go away at night anymore?" Xavier felt a jolt of surprise, so Sarah did understand more than Hope realized. "Your mama told you about that?" Sarah shook her head. "I heard her crying one night after she thought I was asleep. She was thanking God for sending an angel to help us." The girl's eyes were solemn. "Are you an angel, Mr. O'Malley?" Xavier almost laughed at the idea. "No, Sarah, I'm just a man who wanted to help." "Well, I'm glad you did," Sarah declared. "Mama's much happier now. She smiles more, and she's home every night to tuck us in." Xavier swallowed past a sudden tightness in his throat. "I'm glad too." When Hope returned, Xavier rose to take his leave, reluctant though he was to go. "Thank you for the pie and the company, Mrs. Nicholson. It's been a pleasure." "Thank you for coming," Hope replied, walking him to the door. The children called their goodbyes, extracting a promise from Xavier to return soon and tell them more stories. At the door, Xavier paused. "I meant to ask, have you had any luck finding work as a teacher?" Hope shook her head. "Wallace doesn't have a proper school yet, just a few families hiring tutors for their children. But I've started taking in sewing work. Mrs. Sullivan was kind enough to recommend me to some of the ladies in town." "Mrs. Sullivan?" Xavier asked, surprised. "Yes, I paid a call to the ranch yesterday to thank Mr. Sullivan for the meat he sent over after Daniel died. I hadn't been able to face going there before." Hope's expression softened. "He mentioned you've been doing good work." Xavier felt oddly pleased at the knowledge that Hope had asked about him. "Sullivan's a fair boss. I'm glad he spoke well of me." They stood in the doorway, neither quite ready to end the visit. Finally, Xavier said, "I have next Sunday off as well. Perhaps I could call again, maybe bring the children fishing at the creek?" Hope's smile was like sunrise after a long night. They would love that. And so would I. As Xavier rode back to the ranch, he felt lighter than he had in years. The thought of Hope and her children waiting for his next visit gave him something he'd been missing without even realizing it. A purpose beyond the next job, the next town, the next horizon. For the first time in his adult life, Xavier O'Malley was thinking about staying put. The following Sunday couldn't come quickly enough for Xavier. The ranch work was satisfying, but his thoughts constantly drifted to Hope and her children. He found himself watching the road to town whenever he worked in the south pasture, wondering if she might pass by. One evening, he even rode into Wallace on the pretext of needing supplies, but he didn't call at the cabin, telling himself it was too late to disturb the family. The truth was, Xavier was unnerved by the strength of his growing feelings. Hope Nicholson had somehow taken root in his mind and heart in a way no woman ever had. It wasn't just physical attraction, though she was certainly beautiful. It was her quiet strength, her devotion to her children, the dignity with which she faced her hardships. And it was the way she looked at him not as a source of money or protection, but as a man worthy of respect. When Sunday finally arrived, Xavier was up before dawn. He packed a simple picnic bread, cheese, apples, and some cold chicken he'd requested from the ranch cook. He also brought fishing lines and hooks for the children, having noticed a few good-sized trout in the creek near Hope's cabin. The morning was perfect for fishing, clear and cool, with just enough breeze to ripple the surface of the water without making it too choppy. Xavier arrived at the cabin to find the children already waiting outside, their excitement palpable. Thomas raced to meet him, firing questions about fishing techniques, while Sarah tried to maintain a more dignified enthusiasm. Only Rebecca seemed uncertain, clinging to Hope's skirts until Xavier produced a small rag doll he'd purchased in town. "For me?" the little girl whispered, accepting the doll with reverent hands. "Just for you," Xavier confirmed, touching her curls gently. Hope watched this interaction with an expression Xavier couldn't quite read. "You didn't need to bring gifts," she said softly as they walked toward the creek, the children running ahead. "I wanted to," Xavier replied simply. The creek was shallow enough for safety, but deep enough in places to harbor fish. Xavier showed Thomas and Sarah how to bait their hooks, while Hope sat on a blanket with Rebecca, watching the proceedings with amused interest. "Have you fished before, Mrs. Nicholson?" Xavier asked, helping Thomas cast his line. "Call me Hope, please," she said. "And yes, my father taught me when I was about Sarah's age. We lived near a river in Pennsylvania." "Hope," Xavier repeated, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. "Then you must call me Xavier." She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Xavier. The morning passed in pleasant activity. Thomas caught 2 small fish, beaming with pride as Xavier showed him how to clean them. Sarah proved to have remarkable patience for an 8-year-old, sitting quietly with her line in the water until she was rewarded with the largest catch of the day. Even little Rebecca joined in eventually, squealing with delight when Xavier helped her hold the fishing rod. As noon approached, Hope spread out the picnic. The children ate with hearty appetites, their faces flushed from the sun and excitement. After the meal, Thomas and Rebecca dozed on the blanket while Sarah wandered a little way upstream to collect interesting pebbles. For the first time, Xavier and Hope found themselves relatively alone. They sat side by side on a fallen log, watching the water flow past. "Thank you for today," Hope said quietly. "The children haven't been this happy in a long time." Xavier glanced at her profile. "They're wonderful kids. You've done a remarkable job with them, especially considering the circumstances." Hope sighed. "I've tried. But there's so much I wish I could give them that I can't. A proper house, good schooling, new clothes when they need them." She trailed off, then added softly, "A father." Xavier felt his heart rate quicken. They had a father. From what I hear, Daniel Nicholson was a good man. "He was," Hope agreed, a shadow passing over her face. "Daniel was kind and hard-working. He loved the children dearly. When he died," she swallowed hard. "It wasn't just the financial hardship. It was losing their rock, their protector, especially for Thomas. A boy needs a man to show him the way." Xavier thought of his own father, dead before Xavier was 10. "Yes," he said softly. "He does." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the burbling of the creek and the distant voice of Sarah talking to herself as she collected stones. "May I ask you something, Xavier?" Hope said finally. "Anything?" "That night at the saloon, you could have just given me the money. Why did you—" She struggled to find the right words. "Why did you do it that way?" Xavier considered his answer carefully. "I thought it would be better for your reputation. If Harry just told people you had a patron who was paying for exclusivity, it would save you some shame, and it would keep other men from bothering you." Hope nodded slowly. "That was thoughtful. But weren't you worried about what people would think of you? A man who pays for a woman's services for months at a time?" Xavier smiled wryly. "I don't much care what people think of me, Hope. Never have. Besides, I wasn't planning to stay in Wallace long enough for it to matter." "And now?" Hope's voice was very quiet. "Now that you're staying?" Xavier turned to face her fully. Now I care very much what one person thinks of me." The look that passed between them was charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Hope was the first to break eye contact, a blush spreading across her cheeks. "The children are waking up," she said, nodding toward the blanket where Thomas was indeed sitting up, rubbing his eyes. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. As they packed up the picnic and headed back to the cabin, Xavier found excuses to help Hope over rough patches in the path, his hand lingering on her elbow a moment longer than necessary. For her part, Hope seemed more at ease with him, laughing at his jokes and telling him stories about the children's antics. When they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The children, tired from their day of adventure, said their reluctant goodbyes to Xavier and went inside to prepare for bed. Hope lingered on the porch. "Would you like to come to dinner next Sunday?" she asked. "I'm making a pot roast." "I'd like that very much," Xavier replied, "but only if you'll let me bring something. Maybe some of Mrs. Sullivan's preserves? She gave me a jar of peach jam yesterday that's mighty fine." Hope smiled. "That would be lovely." She hesitated, then added, "The children will be looking forward to it, and so will I." As Xavier mounted his horse to ride back to the ranch, he found himself already counting the days until he would see Hope again. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. He had spent so many years avoiding attachments, protecting himself from the pain of loss by never allowing anyone to get close enough to matter. Now, in the span of a few weeks, a widow and her 3 children had somehow breached his carefully constructed defenses. The sensible thing would be to pull back, to protect himself and them from inevitable disappointment. But as Xavier rode away, glancing back to see Hope still standing on the porch watching him go, he knew it was already too late for sensible decisions. His heart had made its choice. Over the next several weeks, a rhythm developed. Xavier would visit the Nicholson cabin every Sunday, sometimes bringing small gifts, a ribbon for Sarah's hair, a wooden toy soldier for Thomas, a picture book for Rebecca. He always brought something practical for Hope as well, flour or sugar, fresh meat from the ranch, once a pair of warm gloves as the autumn weather turned cooler. Hope protested these gifts at first, but Xavier was insistent. "I have no one else to spend my wages on," he told her. "Let me do this small thing." During the week, Xavier threw himself into his work at the Sullivan Ranch with renewed purpose. He no longer saw it as a temporary position, but as the foundation for something more permanent. Mr. Sullivan, recognizing Xavier's skill and dedication, began to entrust him with greater responsibilities, breaking the valuable horses, training new hands, and eventually managing the weekly operations while Sullivan was away on business. "You've got a head for ranching," Sullivan told him one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house going over the books. "Most cowboys are happy to follow orders, but you see the bigger picture." Xavier had never thought of himself as anything but a hired hand, but Sullivan's words planted a seed in his mind. Perhaps there could be more to his future than drifting from job to job. Meanwhile, Hope's circumstances were improving as well. Her sewing business had grown, with several of the wealthier women in Wallace commissioning dresses and other garments. She had also begun tutoring a few children whose parents valued education, but couldn't afford to send them east to school. "I'm thinking of approaching the town council about establishing a proper school," Hope told Xavier one Sunday as they washed dishes together after dinner. The children were playing quietly in the front room. "Mr. Peterson from the general store says there's an unused building that could be converted." Xavier passed her a plate to dry. "That's a fine idea. Wallace is growing. More families are settling here now that the railroad's coming through. They'll need a school." Hope's eyes shone with enthusiasm. "I've missed teaching. It was always my calling, I think. Daniel understood that. He encouraged me to keep up with my reading, even after we moved west and I became a full-time mother." "He sounds like he was a good man," Xavier said, meaning it, despite the irrational twinge of jealousy he felt whenever Hope spoke of her late husband. "He was," Hope agreed softly. Then, after a moment, she added, "But he's gone now, and life must go on." Their eyes met, and Xavier felt that now familiar jolt of connection. Hope looked away first, but not before Xavier saw something in her expression that gave him hope of his own. As autumn deepened toward winter, Xavier began to consider his future more seriously. He had been at the Sullivan Ranch for nearly 3 months now, and though he enjoyed the work, he knew he wanted more both professionally and personally. His feelings for Hope had grown from admiration to something much deeper. He loved her quiet strength, her intelligence, her devotion to her children. He loved the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands when she sewed, the passion in her voice when she spoke of education. He even loved her flaws, her occasional stubbornness, her tendency to take on too much responsibility, her reluctance to accept help. But Xavier was cautious about declaring himself. Hope had been through so much, and he didn't want to pressure her or make her feel indebted to him. And there were the children to consider. They had lost one father. He wouldn't enter their lives only to leave if Hope rejected him. The decision was taken out of his hands one cold November evening. Xavier had ridden into town to purchase supplies for the ranch when he encountered Hope hurrying from the doctor's office, her face pale with worry. "Hope?" he called, dismounting quickly. "What's wrong?" She turned at the sound of his voice, relief washing over her features. "Xavier, thank goodness. It's Rebecca she's burning with fever. Dr. Morgan says it's influenza. He's given me medicine, but she needs constant care. Sarah and Thomas are alone with her now, and I need to get back, but the medicine costs so much, and I didn't have enough left for a wagon ride." Xavier cut off her frantic explanation by taking her arm. "I'll take you home, right now. You can ride with me." Without waiting for a response, he lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. With one arm around her waist to secure her, he urged his horse into a gallop toward the Nicholson cabin. Rebecca was indeed seriously ill. The little girl lay in her bed, her curls damp with sweat, her breathing labored. Thomas hovered anxiously nearby while Sarah bathed her sister's forehead with cool water. "I gave her water like you said, Mama," Sarah reported, "but she didn't want much." Hope immediately took charge, administering the medicine Dr. Morgan had prescribed and giving Xavier instructions to heat water and prepare cool compresses. For the next several hours, they worked together to care for the sick child, their own needs forgotten in their concern for Rebecca. As night fell, Hope insisted that Sarah and Thomas go to bed. "You need your rest," she told them. "I'll watch over Rebecca." "I'll stay too," Xavier said firmly when the older children had reluctantly retired. "You can't manage alone all night." Hope looked too exhausted to argue. Together, they kept vigil at Rebecca's bedside, taking turns applying cool compresses and coaxing sips of water past the child's parched lips. In the quiet of the sick room, with only the sound of Rebecca's labored breathing and the occasional crackle of the fire, barriers that had stood between them seemed to dissolve. "I was so frightened when her fever rose," Hope confessed softly. "All I could think was that I couldn't lose her too, not after everything else." Xavier reached across the bed and took her hand. "You won't lose her. She's strong, like her mother." Hope's fingers tightened around his. "When Daniel died, I thought I would never feel safe again, that my children would never feel safe. But you—" She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've given us that, Xavier. Safety, hope, a future I can believe in again." Xavier felt his heart expand with a joy almost too great to bear. "Hope," he began, but she shook her head. "Let me finish. I need to say this." She took a deep breath. "I've come to care for you, Xavier, more than I thought possible. But I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of relying on someone again. Of opening my heart only to have it broken. My children have already lost so much. I can't let them be hurt again." Xavier moved to kneel beside her chair, still holding her hand. "Hope Nicholson, I have wandered for most of my adult life, never staying anywhere long, never letting anyone get close enough to matter, until I met you and your children." He reached up to touch her cheek. I love you, all four of you. And if you'll have me, I promise I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of that privilege. A tear slipped down Hope's cheek. Oh, Xavier, I love you too. I've tried not to, tried to be practical and sensible, but my heart wouldn't listen. Xavier leaned forward, and their lips met in a kiss that felt both like coming home and setting out on the greatest adventure of his life. It was gentle at first, then deepened as months of restrained emotion finally found expression. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, a small voice from the bed said, "Are you going to be our new papa now?" They turned to find Rebecca awake, her fever-bright eyes watching them with interest. Hope gave a startled laugh, while Xavier felt a surge of emotion at the child's simple question. "Would you like that, little one?" he asked softly. Rebecca nodded solemnly. "Yes, Sarah and Thomas want it too. We talked about it." Hope brushed the damp curls from her daughter's forehead. "Did you now? And when was this discussion?" "After the fishing," Rebecca replied, as if it were obvious. "Thomas said Mr. Xavier teaches him things like Papa did, and Sarah said you smile more when he's here." Her small face grew serious. "And I like him because he doesn't make you cry like the other men did." Hope's face flushed, but Xavier squeezed her hand reassuringly. There would be no secrets between them, no shame in what she had endured to protect her children. "Well, Miss Rebecca," Xavier said, "I would be honored to be your papa, but that's a decision your mama and I will need to discuss when you're feeling better." Rebecca seemed satisfied with this answer. She accepted another sip of water, then drifted back to sleep, her breathing easier than it had been hours before. "Her fever's breaking," Hope whispered, touching her daughter's cheek. "Thank God." Xavier stood, stretching his stiff legs. "You should rest now. I'll watch over her for a while." Hope rose as well, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Xavier steadied her with his hands on her shoulders. "I meant what I said, Hope. I love you. And if you'll have me, I want to marry you. Be a father to your children. Build a life with you." Hope looked up at him, her eyes shining with a happiness Xavier had never seen there before. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Rebecca's illness proved to be a turning point. Though she recovered fully within a week, the crisis had accelerated Xavier and Hope's relationship, bringing their feelings into the open and cementing their commitment to each other. The children were delighted with the news that Xavier would be joining their family permanently, though Sarah, ever practical, had questions about the logistics. "Will we move to the ranch?" she asked one evening as the family sat around the fire. "Or will Xavier live here with us?" Xavier and Hope exchanged glances. They had been discussing this very question privately. "Actually," Xavier said, "I've been talking with Mr. Sullivan about something." He looked at Hope, who nodded encouragingly. "Sullivan owns several parcels of land in addition to the main ranch. There's one about 2 miles from town, 100 acres, with a creek running through it, and a decent house already built. He's offered to sell it to me on good terms." Thomas's eyes widened. "You're buying a ranch?" Xavier nodded. "It's small, but good land, enough to run a modest herd of cattle and have a few horses. Sullivan will even let me take a few head of cattle as part of my payment for the work I've done." "But can we afford it?" Hope asked, ever practical despite already knowing the answer. They had discussed the finances at length, but she wanted the children to understand the reality of their situation. "Between my savings and the arrangement with Sullivan, yes," Xavier confirmed. "It will be tight for a while, and we'll all have to work hard, but within a few years we should be comfortable." Sarah, who had been listening intently, asked, "Will Mama still be able to start her school?" Hope smiled at her daughter's concern. "Yes, sweetheart. The town council approved the school building yesterday. I'll be teaching during the day and coming home to our ranch in the evenings." "Our ranch," Thomas repeated, testing the words. "What will we call it?" Xavier looked thoughtful. "I hadn't considered that. What do you think we should call it?" "Hope Ranch," Sarah suggested immediately. Xavier laughed. "That's fitting. Hope Ranch it is. The wedding took place 2 weeks before Christmas, a simple ceremony in the newly established church in Wallace. The entire town seemed to attend, partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of curiosity about the quiet cowboy who had swept the widow Nicholson off her feet. Hope wore a dress of deep blue made from the fabric Xavier had brought her on his first visit, with her hair arranged in an elegant knot adorned with small white flowers. Sarah served as her mother's attendant, beaming with pride in her new dress. Thomas stood solemnly beside Xavier, taking his role as best man with grave seriousness, while Rebecca scattered wildflower petals down the aisle with enthusiastic abandon. As they spoke their vows, Xavier felt a sense of rightness that transcended the joy of the moment. This was what he had been searching for all those years on the road, not the next horizon, but the journey home. Home to Hope and their children, to the life they would build together. The reception was held at the Sullivan Ranch, with tables set up in the barn, which had been decorated with pine boughs and ribbon for the occasion. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and a general air of celebration that lasted well into the evening. As the festivities wound down, Mr. Sullivan approached the couple with his wife at his side. "I have a wedding gift for you both," he said, handing Xavier an envelope. Inside was the deed to the property they had discussed, the 100 acres that would become Hope Ranch, but with a significant difference. "You've reduced the price," Xavier said, looking up in surprise. Sullivan nodded. "Consider it payment for future services. I'll need a reliable man to help manage the herd expansions I'm planning. And you've proven yourself more than capable." "I don't know what to say," Xavier began, but Sullivan waved him off. "Say you'll have the place ready by spring. I've got 20 new hands coming up from Texas, and I'll need someone with experience to help whip them into shape." After the Sullivans moved on to speak with other guests, Hope squeezed Xavier's hand. "It seems you've found more than a wife and family here in Wallace," she said softly. "You've found a community that values you." Xavier looked around at the gathering, at the townspeople who had welcomed him, at the ranch hands who had accepted him into their brotherhood, at the children who had claimed him as their father, and finally at the woman who had given him her heart. "I've found everything I never knew I was looking for," he replied. They moved to the ranch property 2 days after the wedding. The house was smaller than the Sullivan main house, but larger than Hope's cabin, with 3 bedrooms, a good-sized kitchen, and a comfortable sitting area. It needed work-fresh paint, some roof repairs, a few new windows, but it was sound, and more importantly, it was theirs. The children explored every inch of their new home with excitement, claiming bedrooms and planning where their possessions would go. Sarah, showing a practical streak that reminded Xavier increasingly of her mother, immediately began making lists of things they would need. Thomas was more interested in the barn and the corrals, already imagining the horses and cattle that would soon occupy them. Rebecca simply followed Xavier around, holding his hand and asking endless questions about their new life. That first night, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Xavier and Hope sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the December chill. The stars spread across the sky in a brilliant tapestry, and the land around them, their land, stretched into the darkness. "Are you happy?" Xavier asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Hope leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "Happier than I ever thought possible again," she replied. "When Daniel died, I believed that part of my life was over, that my only purpose was to survive and protect the children. And now?" She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Now I know that life can begin again, that love can be found even in the darkest places." She touched his face gently. "You saved me, Xavier." He shook his head. "You saved yourself, Hope. You did whatever it took to protect your children. I just offered a hand when you needed it." "You offered much more than that," she insisted. "You offered respect when others gave only judgment. You saw me, really saw me when I felt invisible." Xavier kissed her then, pouring into the gesture all the love and admiration he felt for this remarkable woman. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I plan to spend the rest of my life seeing you, Hope O'Malley. Every day, every moment. I like the sound of that, she whispered, and kissed him again. Spring came to Hope Ranch with a burst of new life. The winter had been busy Xavier making repairs to the house and outbuildings, Hope establishing her school in town, the children adapting to their new home and routines. But with the warming weather came the real beginning of their ranching venture. Xavier, with Sullivan's generous assistance, brought 20 head of cattle to the property, along with 4 horses, 2 sturdy working animals for the ranch, a gentle mare for Hope, and a pony for the children. Thomas, now 6, took to riding with natural ability, while Sarah preferred to help with the garden Hope had planted behind the house. Rebecca, at 4, was content to follow whoever would let her, helping, in her enthusiastic if not always effective way. The school in Wallace was a success, with 15 children now attending regularly. Hope rode into town 3 days a week to teach, leaving Xavier with Rebecca on those days while the older children attended classes. These days became special for both Xavier and his youngest daughter, as he taught her about the animals and the land, and she taught him the simple joy of seeing the world through a child's eyes. By summer, the ranch was beginning to prosper. Xavier had hired one hand to help with the cattle, a steady young man named Jim who lived in a small cabin near the barn. The herd was healthy, the crops they had planted were growing well, and the house had truly become a home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the warmth of family life. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hope took Xavier's hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to need to make room for one more," she said softly. Xavier stared at her for a moment, then broke into a grin so wide it almost hurt. "A baby? You're certain?" Hope nodded, her eyes shining. "Dr. Morgan confirmed it yesterday. We should expect a new arrival sometime in early spring." Xavier gathered her into his arms, his heart so full he could barely speak. Another child, a child of their love, a sibling for Sarah, Thomas, and Rebecca. The family he had never dared to dream of was growing. The news was received with mixed reactions by the children. Sarah was delighted, immediately offering to help with the baby's care. Thomas seemed bewildered by the concept, but pleased at the idea of potentially having a brother. Rebecca, however, was less enthusiastic. "But I'm the baby," she protested when told the news, her lower lip trembling dangerously. Xavier lifted her onto his lap. "You'll always be our baby girl," he assured her, "but now you'll be a big sister too. That's a very important job." Rebecca considered this. Her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Can I teach the baby things, like you teach me?" "Absolutely," Xavier promised. "You'll be the best teacher the baby could have." This seemed to satisfy Rebecca, who promptly began making plans for all the things she would show her new sibling. As Hope's pregnancy progressed, the ranch continued to thrive. Xavier added 10 more head of cattle to the herd, and 2 of the mares foaled in the fall, bringing their horse count to 8. Sullivan, true to his word, had Xavier oversee the training of his new hands, an arrangement that benefited both ranches. Hope's school had grown to 22 students, necessitating an assistant teacher, a young woman named Miss Abernathy, who boarded with one of the town families. On a cold February morning, with snow dusting the ground outside, Hope went into labor. The children were sent to stay with the Sullivans, while Xavier remained at his wife's side, holding her hand through the long hours of childbirth. Dr. Morgan had been summoned from town, along with Mrs. Patterson, an experienced midwife who had delivered most of the children in Wallace. "You're doing beautifully, Hope," the doctor assured her as the labor intensified. "The baby is positioned perfectly." Xavier, his face pale with concern, wiped Hope's brow with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her, his voice steady despite his fear. Hope managed a smile between contractions. "Remind me of that when this is over," she gasped as another pain seized her. Just as dawn was breaking, after 15 hours of labor, their son was born a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs. Dr. Morgan placed the squalling infant on Hope's chest, where he immediately quieted, his tiny hand grasping his mother's finger. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, staring in awe at the tiny being they had created together. Hope looked up at her husband, exhausted but radiant. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but hadn't settled on a final choice. Now, looking at his son's serious expression so like Hope's when she was deep in thought, Xavier knew. "Daniel," he said softly. "Daniel Xavier O'Malley." Tears filled Hope's eyes. "After his father's," she said. "Both of them." Xavier nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had never sought to replace Daniel Nicholson in his children's lives or memories, but had instead tried to honor the man who had loved them first. Naming their son after both of them felt right, a recognition of the past that had shaped them and the future they were building together. When the older children returned home that afternoon, they crowded around the bed where Hope rested with the baby, their expressions a mixture of awe and curiosity. "He's so small," Thomas observed, peering at his new brother. "All babies start small," Sarah informed him with the authority of her 10 years. "But they grow. Remember how little Rebecca was?" Rebecca, who had been hanging back slightly, moved closer at the mention of her name. "Can I touch him?" she asked timidly. Hope smiled. "Of course you can, sweetheart. Just be very gentle. Support his head like this." Under Hope's guidance, Rebecca carefully stroked the baby's cheek with one finger. Daniel's eyes, still the unfocused blue of newborns, seemed to turn toward her touch. "He knows I'm his big sister," Rebecca announced with satisfaction. Xavier, watching from the doorway, felt his heart expand with love for this family, his family. From the darkness of that night in the saloon had come a light brighter than he could have imagined. Hope had named him well, for she had indeed given him hope. Hope for a future, hope for belonging, hope for love that would last a lifetime. As the years passed, Hope Ranch grew and prospered. Xavier proved to have a natural talent for breeding and raising cattle, and by 1890, their herd numbered over 200. The ranch expanded to 300 acres with the purchase of adjoining land, and they built a larger home to accommodate their growing family. After Daniel came twin girls, Hannah and Helen, and finally, another boy they named James. The older children thrived as well. Sarah, with her mother's love of learning, went east to attend college, the first woman from Wallace to do so. Thomas, who had inherited Xavier's affinity for horses, took over the ranch's expanding horse breeding operation. Rebecca, still Xavier's shadow in many ways, developed a gift for storytelling and eventually became a teacher in her mother's school. Hope herself remained a pillar of the community, her school growing into a proper academy that served children from Wallace and the surrounding areas. She never forgot the desperate times that had led her to the saloon that night, and she established a fund to help widows and their children in similar circumstances. And Xavier, the drifting cowboy who had never expected to put down roots, found in Hope and their children the home he had always sought without knowing it. The ranch became his legacy, the visible manifestation of the love that had transformed both their lives. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Hope stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset just as they had done that first night on the ranch. Their youngest children played in the yard, while the older ones were scattered, Sarah teaching in Boston, Thomas working with a horse trader in Kansas, Rebecca helping with the evening chores. "Did you ever imagine this?" Hope asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "That night in the saloon, when you gave Harry those coins, did you ever think it would lead to all this?" Xavier shook his head. "I just wanted to help a woman and her children. I never dreamed I'd find my own salvation in the process." Hope turned to face him, her face still beautiful to him despite the lines that 20 years of laughter, worry, and joy had etched there. "We saved each other, I think, and built something neither of us could have created alone." Xavier cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I love you, Hope O'Malley, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, They stood together, no longer the desperate widow and the wandering cowboy, but partners in a life built on the foundation of a single act of kindness that had blossomed into a love story neither could have imagined. And in Wallace, Arizona territory, now grown into a proper town with a railroad station, a school, and businesses that stretched along a main street lined with trees, old-timers sometimes told the story of Hope Nicholson and Xavier O'Malley, the woman who had sold herself to feed her children, and the cowboy who had bought her freedom instead. It had become something of a local legend, polished and embellished with each telling, but at its heart remained the simple truth, that from the darkest moments can come the greatest light, and that love, true love, has the power to redeem even the most broken souls.